Hey guys, it's Derrick Beeler, and this is episode 54 of the History of Aviation podcast. And I'm joined, as always, by Mr. David Rowe. How's it going, David?
It's going very well. A little bit warm out there, but making do and having a good time. Just waiting for something to fly over so I can take some more pictures.
And I'm also joined by Mr. Dave Gorman. How are you, Dave?
Well, now episode 54, that means it's finally caught up to my age.
I like it.
Actually, it's got a few more before it catches up to me. But it's been an interesting week. Had a car accident this week, but everybody was okay, a little banged up.
Good deal.
The car did what it was supposed to do, airbags and all that kind of junk. But that's kind of been the focus of the last part of this past week for me. But looking forward to talking about this rather unusual plane.
Yes, absolutely.
The Shackleton.
Yes.
Glad you're okay, first of all.
Yes.
Thanks. The important stuff. Yeah,
He was trying to
exactly.
straighten the curves like the Duke boys.
that's it. Well,
All
I
right,
will
go.
tell you, I hydroplaned, and I did something that I knew better than to do. I didn't think about it, but I've always heard don't have cruise control on when conditions are not, if conditions are wet or snowy,
Sure.
because if you start to lose traction, you gotta, have your foot off the gas. It happened really, really quickly, but I was driving down Elko Highway, and it's that speed trap. So I put the cruise control on 45 and was just moving right along, feeling pretty good about myself, being smart and everything. And next thing I know, ba-bam, ba-bam. So,
It does happen quick, but
oh boy.
again,
Yep,
glad you're okay and the car will
Definitely.
be replaced and everything will be back to normal soon.
that's the goal.
So, all right, back to the business.
The Shackleton.
Yes.
Now, they named this after a polar explorer,
A very famous one, a British
Ernest
explorer.
Ernest Shackleton,
Uh,
uh, which I thought was interesting because, the plane didn't do anything close to, Arctic expeditions or things like that. But they wanted to honor him, and if you take a close look at this plane, you can kind of see its pedigree. You can kind of see with the tail structure in particular what this plane evolved from.
Absolutely correct. The this was a sort of the grandson of the Lancaster, the famous World War II British bomber. When the RAF decided they needed a maritime reconnaissance aircraft, the best option was to just expand and grow the Lancaster. It actually was the Manchester, the Lancaster, the Lincoln, and Tudor, and then the Shackleton. So they took all those designs and kept making them bigger and better and beefing them up. And that's how we got the Shackleton. As a matter of fact, the center wing section of the Shackleton is the same as the Lancaster. Even the tail started out as a Lancaster tail, but obviously due to the increased power and weight and other issues, they had to redesign it a little bit. But I mean, basically, you're looking at the grandson of the Lancaster.
Well, it's a pretty fascinating aircraft and a history that when I was doing a little research on this thing, I didn't realize it had seen as much uh, action and conflicts around the world. We like to think that in our American-centric view of things, you have World War One, World War Two, Korea, and Vietnam, and those are the main conflicts. But there were conflicts all over the world. In the British Empire, this aircraft was flown and served in the Pacific, in Asia, in North Africa, um, in places all around the world. So a lot of service, didn't it?
Well, that's just it. The British Empire was quite large, and they spread it out wherever they were. One of the interesting things is it's in Cyprus, and you're like, well, why? Well, it's because it's a British colony at one time.
Yep.
So they were taking troops there, and so the Shackleton was the aircraft that took them there.
Well, it's funny you mentioned Cyprus because I was reading about it and saw that there was an airframe uh, at the end of a runway in Cyprus. And so I went to Google Earth and found it pretty quickly. There's actually another airframe that's there that looks pretty damaged from satellite image. But it's there's at least one. Now, whether it could be recovered, whether there's any money in that, who knows? But I was surprised how many of these still exist, actually.
Correct. Obviously in the UK, you would expect there to be quite a few. I believe there's a dozen in the UK. There's actually two that you can still run the engines on that I don't know how regularly they do it. The last videos I saw were from about 6 or 8 years ago. But I mean, they're still basically up and running, living aircraft. We even have one in the United States at the Pima Air and Space Museum in Tucson.
Boy,
Arizona.
that's one that I've got to get to because they've got some very rare aircraft and that desert environment. I always think, God, that can't be good to be out in that heat. But like they say, it's a mostly dry heat, so that does help preserve, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. You were talking about wrecks. Cyprus has a couple of them. They actually have three. I can't even say the word now. Shackletons in Cyprus, but there is one that's actually in the Sahara Desert that they were ferrying it from South Africa to England, and it crashed in the desert, and it still sits there today. So you can actually find it, and they're not going to recover it. It just remains where it is in place, but it's out there.
Yeah, South Africa was the other user of this aircraft, right?
Correct. Yeah, basically it was the RAF and the South African Air Force.
And they have a few of them on display down in South Africa still. But yeah, the one that crashed in the desert was on its way back to England to be put on display or something, I think. And
At
so that was,
Duxford, of
yeah,
all places. Yeah,
yeah.
and it just did not quite make it. However, South Africa has one. I believe it's called Pelican 22. That is probably the closest to airworthy status that there is. That it still runs, and they've got it at the South African Air Force Museum at Air Force Base Jasterplaat. But it says it's airworthy, but has been grounded for safety and preservation reasons, as well as a lack of qualified crew. So
Well,
hard
that
to
makes
fly it.
sense. I mean,
Yeah,
this thing was being developed 70 years ago, so
yeah,
it's it'd be tough to stay current in it, that's for sure. Um,
absolutely.
one of the features that is most noticeable, of course, and gives away its heritage is that tail, the Lancaster tail. But this aircraft was shaped like a Lancaster in some ways, but it was significantly different. Um, First and foremost, the contra-rotating propellers.
Exactly. That's one of the most distinctive features on it is those 13-foot diameter propellers spinning in two directions at once. This was done because of the short landing gear. The mid wing has the engines underneath the wing, so ground clearance was an issue. So you couldn't put giant propellers on it. And with the double propellers, you could. What was it they said that you would? Uh, Increase the diameter of the propellers to absorb the engine's power and torque. And this, it allowed it to have the same area to pull wind, but in a smaller space because they were doubled up.
Doubled up, yeah. And I thought it was interesting to read about those jet engines that were buried in the nacelles on the outboard engines. And
Right.
I
That was
saw
in
some
the,
pictures of that. Yeah, that was really pretty smooth how they made that work.
yeah, that's the first time I've ever seen it installed in an engine nacelle. It's on the outboard engines, and basically as an airplane over its lifespan, they keep adding things to it. They get heavier, they get a little bit slower, a little bit harder to take off, and so the Mark III version or the MR3. They added these Armstrong Siddeley Viper Mark 203 turbojet engines, and basically they were needed for takeoff, just to get that big heavy plane into the air quickly. And that's a new feature that I'm not aware of anybody else that puts them there.
Well, I hadn't seen that. That was interesting.
Yeah.
Now, I know that folks won't be able to see these pictures that are behind us, Although Derrick, I know sometimes you put some clips up,
Yeah, I'll put
but
some clips up on that.
yeah, I want to make sure we add our pictures, David, to the on Facebook when people are clicking on this.
Yeah.
The example I have behind me has got a radome underneath the nose, but it also has a tail wheel. Your example, move your head a little bit to the side there, has a nose wheel. And I thought that was a pretty fascinating thing in the development of this aircraft that it went from a tail dragger to a nose wheel aircraft.
Exactly. It was a design feature to help with the taxiing and takeoff to make it easier for the pilots to get around on, which is always why they switched to a tricycle configuration, is because it's just easier to maneuver on the ground with. But yeah, this aircraft went from a tail dragger to a tricycle.
And I notice your picture also has tip tanks.
Yeah, I think that's pretty common with a lot of the later variants is
Yeah.
they all got the tip tanks because this aircraft could fly for, I had quotes of 13 hours up to about 18 hours, depending on fuel load. So, I mean, this plane could stay in the air for a very, very long time. Apparently, it would fly at very low heights, like 500 feet above the ocean, as it was searching for submarines. So low and slow and for a very long time.
Well, I keep thinking, if you have a 14-hour mission with those propellers, that had to be so incredibly loud inside.
Well, as a matter of fact, I did read somewhere that some of the crew had high end hearing loss because this aircraft was incredibly loud. Those Griffin engines with the twin props just created a howl that it doesn't sound like your typical, Lancaster or B-17 or, what you would expect a four-engine aircraft to sound like. This was loud.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the mission. You mentioned submarines, and this plane was designed as a maritime patrol aircraft, kind of like our privateer, the American privateer, I guess. It was a development of the B-24. The privateer did maritime patrol and things like that, interdiction stuff like that. I was amazed to read that this plane actually was armed with nuclear depth charges.
Yes. So the whole purpose of this aircraft originally for the RAF was it was a Cold War response to the Russian growth in the Cold War. They're the Russian Navy, the Soviets were growing their Navy, and their submarines were, in particular, were getting very hard to find. So they needed an aircraft that could hunt the subs. And that's exactly what this aircraft was built for. And again, it was simple to just, modernize the Lancaster airframe into something that worked, to do the same kind of job that like our P3 Orion does, or the P8. It's sort of the same, platform doing the same sort of job.
Well, it was interesting that they were able to extend the life of that design anyways. And as we've learned many, many times, though, there are lots of revisions and lots of updates based on, crew feedback or success or lack of success, in terms of the radar that it carried, the defensive armament that it carried. There was a turret on top of some of the early models, nose, there were cannons in the nose, all kinds of things that this was capable of carrying. Had a pretty good capacity for weapons, didn't it?
Yeah, it had a pretty good bomb load. What was it here? 10,000 pounds of bombs it could carry, torpedoes, mines, conventional, and the nuclear depth charge, the Mark 101 Lulu, which I'm not familiar with. That was a new one for me.
That was that nuclear depth charge, the Lulu.
Exactly. Yeah.
Crazy.
Yeah, that's just, but that was in response again to the Soviet subs that could dive very deep. They're new, they could dive deeper than previous versions. And in order to get to them, you had to have a weapon that could reach deep. It also carried ASV radar, sonobuoys, submarine detection equipment, blue silk Doppler radar, TACAN, GPI Mark IV, GM7 compass, So it had all sorts of things. One of the more interesting things I read is it had a diesel sniffer that when it was flying low to the ocean, that it would sniff for the diesel. So as a submarine was running on the surface, it would smell the diesel fumes. Don't believe it worked very well. Don't think they used it much, but that's one of the things that was built into the aircraft.
That's kind of where the technology was, what could give it away,
Exactly.
And
Yeah.
so when you're flying overhead and at 500 feet or lower, and you're looking for conning towers or looking for wake disruption or whatever, if you can pick up the diesel fumes, that's an advantage. So, not surprised
Absolutely.
they tried it, but um, you know, you'd have to be really following that trail probably to track it down like a bloodhound. If you just overfly it perpendicular to the path of the submarine, you might not pick it up, but
You
that's
might not.
interesting stuff.
Right. Some of the other things that it could do, we talked about maritime patrol, anti-submarine. It also did search and rescue, airborne early warning, which is the aircraft you've got with that big bulbous radar dome below the cockpit. It also was a troop transport, and it did mail delivery. One of the more famous things that I saw was that it flew 1,000 miles to meet up with a British ship in the ocean to deliver mail, to just show how good the aircraft was. And, flew out, dropped some canisters of mail, and then flew back home. So, simple as mail delivery.
I bet it was very appreciated.
Uh,
Now, I,
I'm,
I could not find any stories about submarine interdictions. Did you
I
see anything about any weapons against submarines? I mean, I know they never dropped a nuclear depth charge, but they clearly were tracking. But I didn't find anything about any forced surfacings or things like that happening. Did you?
I did not find anything, regarding a Soviet submarine or anything of that nature. I did see that it did some conventional bombing in Africa. It also did a conventional depth charging, which we'll get to in a little bit, to an oil tanker in South Africa. But no, not against a sub, no combat per se against any submarines, although I'm sure it was out there looking all the time.
Well, England being a basically an aircraft carrier, an island out there,
Surrounded by water.
absolutely. So, you'd want to you'd have American patrol bombers and submarines in the area, uh, reconnaissance happening all the time. They were just part of that effort to keep the Soviet Union contained, or if not contained, at least we knew where they were.
Exactly.
And I saw, search and rescue. This plane was used for search and rescue, and I think I read that there was at one point they had a crew and an aircraft on standby 24 hours, just because that was with the long legs, as you mentioned, being able to get out and patrol for over 1,000 miles, that would come in handy.
Absolutely. I read the same thing as well, that they, standby crew at all times were ready to go, anytime there was an issue.
Um, so speed wise, uh, what did I say? About 300 miles an hour.
Performance of, 300 miles an hour, range of 2240 miles. Here it says the endurance is 14 hours and 36 minutes. And I read or heard on a video up to 18 hours. But again, I think that's when they've got wing tanks and are leaning out the engines quite a bit. Service ceiling of about 20,000 feet. So, it's not a high flyer. It's meant to just low and slow and just, search. That's what it's made for.
Well, and it filled a role in the interim, as submarine warfare and submarine technology was improving, uh, and the Soviet submarines were a definite threat to the rest of the world. And so this is what was available. This is what was created, and served in that role pretty well. And in England, at least, it was superseded by the Nimrod, that jet-powered patrol aircraft that came on in the 70s. But this
Correct.
plane had about 20 years of service in the RAF, right?
Well, in total, it had 40 years of service. But now what you're talking about is when the Nimrod came along, they retired it from that maritime patrol duty. And because they didn't have an airborne early warnings aircraft, they converted 12 of the Shackletons into early warning aircraft. And those continued in service until 1991 because England couldn't. I think they were trying to use the Nimrod as that platform, but they never could work out the bugs. And eventually they just bought an American AWACS, an E3, and that's what they went with. And that's when the Shackleton was officially retired, is when they purchased the E3s to replace it.
E3. So yeah, okay, thanks for the correction. 40 years of service for this aircraft.
Yeah, it started in 51 and ended in 91.
Goodness.
Yeah. So it served it for a long time, and it was the need. It was a solid platform, and the need precipitated its continued use.
Well, and you mentioned South Africa a little while ago. This aircraft was used by the South African Air Force in much the same way with the patrol. That coastline off of Cape of Good Hope and Cape Horn, I guess that was heavily trafficked as people came around the African continent. But it was a place where South Africa recognized some vulnerability as well. So this aircraft was used to patrol that area. It was also, you mentioned about that incident where it did sink a ship, didn't it?
Yes, it did. So the South Africans were using the Short Sunderland flying boat, the leftover World War II aircraft, and those, over time they wore out. So they purchased 8 Shackletons from the British and for South African service, and they used it between 1957 and 1984. And again, it was just what you said. They patrolled that Cape Hope area, particularly to look for Soviet ships coming in and out, tracking them. It did say they lost one Shackleton. It flew into a mountain and killed everyone on board. So they did lose one of them to an accident. But the most famous thing that they did was there was an oil tanker that ground offshore, a couple of miles offshore of that one of the capes there as you're coming around the corner.
Yeah, lost its steering or something, right?
Exactly. Yeah, something about water got into the engines and killed it, and they couldn't get it started. Anyway, it was called the SS Wafra oil tanker. This is March of 1971, and apparently so it's stuck on this reef. They go out and they try to tow it away. The line breaks. They take another boat out. It breaks. They get a tug that actually gets it loose and gets it out into the water, but it starts to break apart. Well, all this time, it's leaking thousands and millions of gallons of oil. And apparently there is an African penguin colony that was, on a small island very nearby. And there's all kinds of other maritime, fish and wildlife, birds, what have you there. So they decided we're just going to take the biggest part and tow it out to sea and just sink it to try to stop the oil leaking on the surface. So they hooked it up, towed it about 200 miles offshore. And the interesting part is they had Buccaneers jets with some anti-ship missiles, and they sent 5 or 6 of these Buccaneers out to sink it. Well, they shot it full. I think it said 7 missiles struck it. It would not sink. So they said, all right, Shackletons, you're up. They took their depth charges out there, and after about 6 or 8 depth charges, they sunk it.
So did the crew paint a silhouette of an oil tanker underneath the cockpit there?
I'm sure they did. I haven't seen that, but I wouldn't imagine.
I imagine there's a story about it out there somewhere if we dig deep enough.
Absolutely.
But now you mentioned that there's one in Pima on display.
Yes.
And do you recall? I remember when they got that because I think they were still doing engine run-ups. Was it flown to Pima or was it trucked there?
If I remember, it was flown there.
Yeah.
That's how I remember it, but I did not read that for sure, so I'm not 100% positive.
I'll look that up and we'll add that in some
Yeah,
commentary afterwards.
yeah, but I believe it was flown there. But now I don't know the history of that aircraft, how they ended up with it, or what its service was beforehand.
I saw that they said that there is one of these in the Imperial War Museum, which is in London. And I visited the Imperial War Museum on my honeymoon, and I don't remember seeing it there. I need to look into that and see when it
He
arrived. But
walked
I
right
don't,
past it.
I must have walked right past it. Like, that's the weirdest looking Lancaster I've ever seen.
Yeah, well, that's probably it. You just walked by and went, "Oh, another Lancaster," and just kept on
Exactly.
walking.
Can you imagine?
No, not really, because it's different. One of the interesting things, so I said it has the same center wing section, but because of the shorter propellers, because they're doubled up, they've widened the fuselage. If you look at that aircraft from the nose, it's like twice as wide as your Lancaster was. And that was intentional. They did that because inside of this aircraft, I think there's 13 crew on board, and like 8 or 9 of those are basically radar intercept. It's all stations inside. And so they had to have a wide bodied aircraft for all these crew members to sit and look at their screens and all their electronic equipment. If I've seen an interior picture, and the guys getting into their seats literally had to jump up over the seat to get down into it. It is packed full inside there of electronics. Apparently, it was extremely hot in the back of the aircraft because of all the electronics, and the front was very cold because it was obviously out in the air.
Well, I saw a picture that showed crew positions and things like that, and I thought, there are no windows along the fuselage. Those guys have their heads into screens.
Absolutely. Yes.
And yeah, I've taken some long flights. I've flown from LA to Australia, which was 12 or 13 hours or something. And even at nighttime, I like keeping the window open. I couldn't see anything. It's pitch black. But just knowing that, there it
Yeah.
is outside. I can't imagine being inside of this aircraft for a 14-hour flight and not be able to see anything outside. Just, your whole job is just that screen in front of you.
There's a table, and you've got
Yep.
charts and a screen and knobs, and they're wearing their headsets and oxygen mask if they're necessary. They're all on the job the whole time. There is
Yep.
no, although I did read that there is a crew rest station in the back. So to reduce fatigue on the crew, they actually built a galley into the aircraft. And one of the interesting things I heard on a video was that they had good meals on this aircraft because it had an oven in the galley. Now the oven was only 8 inches by 12 inches in size, so it's like a sheet of paper big, and only I think it was 6 or 8 inches deep. So it's very small, but literally they had somebody on there cooking for these 13, 14, 18-hour flights. And there was a place where you could sit down or lay down and rest. So they did have crew comfort in mind because of the length of these flights.
Well, I'm sure the old Lancaster pilots gave the Shackleton guys grief about, oh, an oven? Sure thing. But yeah, you guys have it tough.
Yep.
Crew
Well,
quarters? What is that? Yeah.
I did hear some interviews with some of the crew from like in the early 90s, that the old Lancaster guys would come out and look at it and walk through it. And they all felt like it was, they were in a Lancaster again because it's so similar.
Mm.
There was some video of them going in the aircraft, and, from the outside, it looks nice and clean and, shiny. And on the inside, it's like your typical World War II bomber. It's just sheet metal, ribs, and everything's rubbed and raw and worn out because it's a used aircraft. It's
Yep.
just it's that heritage of the World War II type aircraft was that's what it was inside.
Did you see anything about them having to beef up the landing gear? You mentioned about all the electronic equipment that it carried and a bomb load, but I mean, it became a significantly heavier aircraft over its service.
Exactly. I did
but
see that they had to.
yeah, that's good.
Well, yeah, and if you the tires are quite large on this. Those little the single tires,
Yep.
they're big, thick tires. So again, that's a lot of weight. I mean, it necessitated jet engines to help it take off. So yeah, that's a heavy airplane.
Another thing that I was looking for information on was just its operations, and it seemed like, I mean, it did maritime patrol around England, and it, as we mentioned, it was involved in some conflicts in Africa and Asia and the Middle East. Um, did this aircraft ever have any run-ins with Soviet fighter aircraft?
Yes, I did see some videos where it would, when the Tupolev Bear would come flying by, that this aircraft would go up and meet it. So it did do some intercepts with the was it the TU 97
Tu-95.
95? Thank you. So
Also with counter-rotating propellers.
exactly. So in the same vein, but yes, I saw some video where they actually did. That was one of their jobs, was when those bears would come across, they would. I don't know if they actually went up to meet them or if they just sent the fighters up to meet them, but they were involved in that. Hey, we've got somebody coming to visit. Let's go see them.
Yeah, well, maybe in tracking the bear and directing the intercepts to, what approach to make to be sure that they caught up and intercepted. Maybe
Exactly.
things like that.
Yes, absolutely. That was one of their duties. Yes.
What was the total number of Shackletons and all makes and models that were built?
It was a whopping 185. They were built from 1951 until 1958, and only 185. And out of that, I think we said 12, 13, 18, 19, like 20 are left. So not many.
That's pretty good. I mean, you think about B-24s, how many of those were built?
Well, that's
17 or 18,000, and
there's
a lot
yeah,
less of them. So,
a lot less.
you think about keeping an assembly line open. The guys building this probably had built Lancasters and Lincolns, so they had that experience, and but building a propeller-driven aircraft into the late 50s when jets were all the rage and all the effort to modernize, and this thing kind of looked like a dinosaur probably compared to some of the new shiny things that were coming off the line.
Well, in that vein, the video I was watching of those crew members from the '90s, talking about seeing the older veterans come see their aircraft. In one of the scenes, as the Shackleton is taxiing out, as it clears the screen, there is an F-16 sitting on the ramp right behind it. So that's the kind of you know change in technology. You've got a Shackleton, which is literally an old, a new World War II bomber against our modern F-16 today, on the same ramp.
The modern F-16 that's almost 50 years old,
Yeah, exactly.
right?
Yeah, I don't know what version they're on the F-16, but it's a bunch.
It's up there, that's for sure. Well, this is a
But
pretty,
it's the view of seeing a World War II bomber active duty go by, and then there's an F-16. It's like,
exactly.
that's a change in, it's amazing that it survived in that environment.
Yep, definitely is. I was looking for some of the accidents, and you mentioned the loss of the South African aircraft where all the crew were killed. But there were some crashes. There was an interesting two aircraft that were operating, I think, on a training mission together, and they were in contact with their bases, and then all of a sudden they weren't, and they assumed that it was a midair collision. They didn't find any wreckage. I think it was in does it say 1955 maybe was the collision. They found a propeller from maybe an engine from one of the aircraft 11 years later.
Wow.
And I wondered if it got tangled up in a trawler's net or something, and that's where they brought it up. But there were two Shackletons that disappeared, and they were supposed to stay like 85 miles away from each other, I think I read, and something happened, and they ended up both being lost, and they still don't really know what happened. They assume it was a collision.
Well, that's, things happen, and there's no way to find out. It's not like they
Yep.
have a flight data recorder or anything we can locate. So
Yep.
we'll never know. It's just unfortunate. That's, part of the hazards of duty.
For sure. Well, there are videos of these guys flying at air shows and some of the on duty takeoffs and things like that. So we may never see one fly again, although there are a few that maybe could be restored to flight status.
Yes, there are.
That would be cool. But there are videos where you could enjoy seeing this as you said, the grandson of the Lancaster.
Yeah, one of the interesting videos I saw during an air show, they would shut down 3 of the engines and do a low fast pass with just a single engine. The Shackleton was very capable of flying on one engine, which was pretty impressive to see it come zooming past the camera. Yeah, pretty amazing. So, and again, like you were saying, there are a lot of videos from the UK of them actually running the survivors. There's 2 in England that are still running. There's one at Coventry Airport and one at Gatwick Aviation Museum. And both of those, they run engines from time to time. So, I mean, literally, you could go to England and, see one running, listen to the howl of the engines.
Well, Avro built another aircraft that had quite an engine howl, and they were making them at the same time as this, and that's kind of amazing too because they're of different eras. But the Vulcan was well known for that engine howl that it had as well.
Oh my goodness, that was I hated to see that one go away because it made such a lovely sound as it went by. It set off car alarms in the parking lots over there. It was amazing to see. I used to watch the live streams for that last few years that it flew, and it was just the howl and just the way they would bank it. I mean, Avro they designed some really tough aircraft,
like 60 or 70-degree bank angles in that
Oh
thing.
yeah, it's ridiculous.
So I don't think the Shackleton had that type of maneuverability
Or
but
speed.
but definitely the pedigree and a great plane here.
Yeah, absolutely. Uh, here's a couple of interesting quotes I heard. The Shackleton was often described as 100,000 rivets flying in close formation.
I saw that. Yeah.
So
It's a lot
that
of
kind of
work.
describes the construction of it. Lots of pieces and parts. A couple of the other things.
Well,
The
hang on. You think about all that with the counter-rotating propellers, 2 propellers per 4 engines, and 2 additional jet engines. That's 10. That's not. It's 4 engines plus the 2 jets. That had to be a lot of rattling going on. So
Oh,
uh,
absolutely.
the ground crew was probably pretty busy on this a lot, weren't they?
I would think so.
Yeah.
I did read that it was a little bit maintenance intensive. That there was a lot of work that they had to do on it. What was it that they said? The diesel fume detection system was prone to false alarms and thus received little operational use. Engines, hydraulics, and avionics were known for unreliability, and it proved to be fairly maintenance intensive. But it's just like any other aircraft. Things break, you fix them, and you keep it going.
Keep it going.
But back to the names of the aircraft, the little stories that I was reading. Some of the crews called it the Old Gray Lady because obviously it was a gray aircraft in the sea. And the other thing was they nicknamed it the Growler because of the sound it made.
I like
So,
that. I thought that was hilarious.
yeah, that was pretty good. But now the other one, this was a funny between the crew. Apparently, the pilots called the all the radar operators in the back, all those crew members back there working the dials. They called them talking freight.
Oh,
Talking
yeah.
freight.
and
Yeah.
and those guys,
Oh
those
my
guys
God.
in the back, called the pilots drivers.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Just
So a little
yeah.
good-natured ribbing, and it's always good, always good. So
Talking freight.
talking
Man,
freight, I love that. I
that's
had to bring that up because that was just too funny not to mention.
yeah. Oh, did the freight say something? We weren't
Exactly.
listening.
So anyway, a great airplane, long history, great, bones, of growth. And I'm glad we covered this one because I knew of it, but I didn't know what I know now about it. So glad we talked about it.
I'm getting pretty sneaky with that aircraft encyclopedia I got.
Hey, keep digging. Keep digging.
That's right.
So as we're talking about the Shackleton here on episode 54 of the History of Aviation podcast, David Rowe, you just got back from Florida.
I did. Had a nice trip to St. Augustine, spent several days just chilling on the beach. Got to see some Jayhawks fly by, a couple of Dolphins helicopters fly by. The cool thing I got to do is I took a little side trip up to Jacksonville, and I discovered the Military Museum of Northern Florida. It's not very heavily aviation. It's kind of all military. They did have an Apache cockpit inside the museum, a lot of models and dioramas with aircraft in it, tons of uniforms. There were weapons, lots of great things to see. Outside, they had Jeeps and trucks. They had a giant army, and for the lack of a better description, it looks like your typical landing craft, but it's an army with wheels. Look it up, Museum of North Florida, and it's a giant. It's got alligator teeth on the front like a P-40 does. And the one cool part about it was they had a P-40 wreck. So I walked in and I looked at the wings and I went, oh, or not a P-40, a Corsair. They had the bent wing, and I went, that's a Corsair wreck. And sure enough, they had pulled one out of the ocean, and
wow.
It was a Corsair wreck. So anyway.
Well, were you able to take any pictures, Dave?
Oh, I think just give me a few more days and there'll be a post with a whole lot of photography.
On aerophile.com.
Aerophile, please come check me out.
Well, I look forward to seeing it. I don't know about that museum. That sounds like
never heard of it.
Yeah.
Well, and the only reason I found it is I was looking at routes from, St. Augustine to Jacksonville. And as I was following the route, I'm like, hey, there's a museum of what? Okay, well, we're stopping there.
Done.
And
yep.
I'm glad I did.
And Dave Gorman, we're glad you're safe. And what have you had going on?
Well,
with your social media.
Yeah, I've got some recent music videos that I've uploaded. But looking forward to Oshkosh here in about a month, where the last flying Lancaster is due to make an appearance. So I'll see the granddaddy of the Shackleton here at the end of July up in Wisconsin. Look forward to taking a bunch of video up there. And there's always a lot of interesting things. And I shoot a lot of video of planes taxiing past. I take still pictures usually when they're flying, not a lot of video of flying. Depends what it is. But I look forward to getting a lot more videos up so folks can see what's going on.
Good deal.
But that's Gormania is the YouTube channel. So you can look for me there.
Good deal. In the History of Aviation podcast, Dave Gorman, where do we start?
Where do we start? Well, you could go there and chat with us if you have any comments or suggestions or requests. If we got something wrong, if you can beat Bruce to the correction, then I will make sure that we send you a sticker from the from the History of Aviation podcast. Right, Derrick?
That's right. We could do it. We got the Facebook group. We got the Facebook page. We're on Instagram, Twitter. We got our website. You can do everything on the website. You can email us. You could listen to the podcast there. We're on Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, Spotify. We're on every single platform that's known. And as soon as a new one pops up, we're on it. So
that works well. You can find us all over the place.
And all those links are listed down below for all of this you heard tonight. And guys, I appreciate it. Another interesting aircraft.
Number 54. That's fantastic.
Yes. 54 with 4 engines. There we go.
You can't beat that.
Again, if you guys have a suggestion on what you'd like us to talk about, please let us know. And any of those platforms that Derrick mentioned where you can give us some feedback, we'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, definitely. For David Rowe, Dave Gorman. I'm Derrick Beeler. Thanks for listening to the History of Aviation Pod.
Quiet, numbskulls. I'm broadcasting.
This is Joe Morse. You are listening to the History of Aviation podcast with Derrick Beeler, David Rowe, and David Gorman.